What if the most powerful religious leader on earth tried to stop a war and failed? When we hear the name John Paul II, we think of a saint, a man of God, a symbol of peace. But behind that image was a pope who entered secret negotiations with dictators, sent personal emissaries to Washington, and knelt before the enemy's holy book in a last desperate act of diplomacy. A pope who tried to stop the deadliest invasion of the 21st century, and no one was supposed to know. Today, the silent church uncovers the hidden political campaign of John Paul II, the secret meetings, the unanswered letters, the kiss that was never fully explained. But before we begin, if you are new here, subscribe. Every week we reveal the history the church never officially told you, and tell us in the comments, do you think a pope should intervene in war, or should the church stay silent? May 14th, 1999, Vatican City. A private audience room inside the Apostolic Palace. The air was still, the walls lined with centuries of Catholic history, paintings of saints, crosses, the weight of 2,000 years in every stone. A delegation had arrived from Iraq, not diplomats, not politicians, a Shiite imam, a Sunni banker, a representative of Saddam Hussein's Ministry of Religion. They carried a gift, a green book with golden embroidery on the cover, the Qur'an, the holy scripture of Islam. The same faith that Catholic crusaders had fought for 4 centuries, the same book that Rome had called the word of a false prophet. They placed it in the hands of the most powerful Christian on earth. And then something happened that no one in that room expected. The Pope bowed his head, he closed his eyes, and he kissed it. The photograph left the Vatican within hours. It traveled across television screens in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Tehran. Muslims wept. Catholic traditionalists erupted in fury. Sedevacantists declared the papacy had fallen. But no one asked the real question. Why was that delegation in the Vatican at all? What were they really negotiating? And why did John Paul II, the most visible Catholic leader since Peter himself, choose that moment to cross a line no pope had ever crossed before? This is not a story about a kiss. This is a story about a war that never had to happen, about secret meetings in marble halls, about a dying pope who spent his final years trying to stop the most powerful army on earth, and about whether any of it made a difference. To understand why that kiss shook the world, you have to go back. Not to 1999, not even to the 20th century. You have to go back 1,000 years. In the year 1095, a pope stood on a field in Clermont, France. His name was Urban II. He raised his hand before a crowd of thousands and spoke 11 words that would define the next 4 centuries. God wills it. Take up the cross. March to Jerusalem. The First Crusade had begun. What followed was not a holy mission. It was a massacre. Christian armies marched through Muslim territories, leaving rivers of blood behind them. In Jerusalem alone, chronicles from both sides recorded that the streets ran red for days. The Muslims never forgot, and neither did the church. For the next 900 years, the relationship between Rome and Islam was built on that foundation. Suspicion, fear, theological contempt on both sides. Catholics were taught that Muhammad was a false prophet. Muslims were taught that the Crusaders were the face of Christian civilization. 2 faiths, 1 God, and centuries of war between them. But here is what history rarely teaches. It was never inevitable. In the early centuries of Islam, Christian and Muslim scholars lived side by side in Baghdad and Cordoba. They translated Greek philosophy together. They debated theology in the same rooms. There were moments when the 2 faiths almost found common ground. Almost. The Crusades ended that conversation for 800 years. By the time Karol Wojtyła was born in 1920, in a small Polish town called Wadowice, the Catholic Church had not made a single formal gesture of reconciliation toward Islam. Not one. He grew up in a Poland where Catholics and Jews lived in the same streets, where religious difference was not abstract, where you saw it in the faces of your neighbors. His father was a simple man, a retired army lieutenant, no wealth, no connections, no political ambition. He raised his son with one principle above all others. Every human being carries the face of God. That idea seems simple. But inside the institution Karol Wojtyła would one day lead, it was almost revolutionary, because for most of its history, the Catholic Church did not extend that principle to Muslims. Not officially, not formally, not without conditions. And then came the Second Vatican Council. In 1962, Pope John XXIII opened the most significant internal reform in 400 years of Catholic history. Bishops and cardinals from every continent gathered in Rome. The agenda was radical for its time. Could the Church acknowledge that other faiths contained elements of truth? Could Rome officially declare that Muslims and Catholics worshipped the same God? The debates were fierce, the resistance was powerful. Centuries of theological tradition pushed back against every proposed change. But in 1965, the Council published a document called Nostra Aetate, 4 words in Latin. In our time. It was 4 pages long. But those 4 pages contained something the Church had never officially said in 2,000 years of existence: that Muslims worship the one true God, that they honor Jesus as a prophet, that Abraham is a common father to both faiths. It did not erase the Crusades. It did not resolve the theological differences. It did not make the 2 religions equal in Catholic doctrine, but it opened a door, and a young Polish cardinal named Karol Wojtyła had voted in favor of it. He remembered that vote 13 years later, when he became Pope, when he inherited both the open door and the 1,000 years of rubble behind it. The question was what he would do with both. On October 16, 1978, white smoke rose over St. Peter's Square. The crowd below did not know the name yet. They knew only that the conclave was over, that 111 cardinals had entered the Sistine Chapel 4 days earlier, that 8 ballots had been cast, that something unexpected had happened inside those walls. Then the name came: Karol Wojtyła, a Polish cardinal, 58 years old, the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. The crowd fell silent for a moment, and then erupted. What most people do not know is what happened inside that conclave before the white smoke appeared. The cardinals had entered divided. The Italian bloc pushed their own candidates. The progressive wing wanted reform. The conservative wing wanted stability. Wojtyła was nobody's first choice. He was the compromise that nobody had planned. But from the moment he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and spoke his first words to the crowd, something was clear. This pope had a plan. Not just for the Church, for the world. John Paul II had grown up under Nazi occupation. He had lived under Soviet communism. He had watched ideology after ideology attempt to replace God with the state. He believed with absolute conviction that religion was the most powerful political force on earth, and he intended to use it. His first years as Pope were defined by one mission above all others: the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. He traveled to Poland in 1979. 1 million people came to see him in Warsaw alone. The images terrified Moscow. Within a decade, the Soviet bloc had collapsed. Western media called it a political miracle. Historians debated his role for years. But inside the Vatican, the conclusion was simpler. The Pope had moved a wall that armies could not move. If he could do that in Eastern Europe, what else was possible? It was in this context that John Paul II began to look east, not toward Moscow, toward Mecca, toward Baghdad, toward the 1 billion Muslims who had never heard a pope speak to them as equals. The shift was quiet at first. In 1985, he addressed a crowd of 80,000 young Muslims in Casablanca, Morocco. No pope had ever done anything remotely like it. He spoke about Abraham, about shared values, about the possibility of peace between the 2 faiths. The crowd received him in silence at first, then applause, then something closer to disbelief. A man who worked as a translator at that event later described the atmosphere in a published memoir. His name was Hassan. He was 26 years old at the time, born in Casablanca, the son of a mosque schoolteacher. Hassan had expected hostility. He had prepared for confrontation. Instead, he watched 80,000 Muslims listen to the Bishop of Rome speak about their prophet with respect. He said afterward that he went home and could not sleep, not from anger, from confusion, because nothing in his education had prepared him for that moment. John Paul II was not naive about the theological distance between the two faiths. He knew the Qur'an denied the divinity of Christ. He knew the history of the Crusades could not be erased with a speech in Morocco. But he believed something that very few inside the Vatican shared at the time, that the alternative to dialogue was catastrophe. He had seen what happened when ideologies stopped talking. He had watched it in Poland. He had watched it in the Second World War. And by the mid-1990s, he was watching it again, this time in Iraq. The United States had imposed devastating economic sanctions on the country after the Gulf War of 1991. The United Nations estimated that 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a result of those sanctions by 1996. 500,000 children. John Paul II spoke about those numbers from St. Peter's Square. He called the sanctions a form of slow violence against a civilian population. Washington did not respond. The Pope was 75 years old. His hands trembled from Parkinson's disease. His voice was weakening, but his mind was clear, and he had one move left. In the spring of 1999, the world was watching Kosovo. NATO bombs were falling on Serbia. Refugees were crossing borders on foot. The evening news was full of burning villages and displaced families. But inside the Vatican, John Paul II was watching something else. Iraq. The American bombing campaigns had continued for years after the Gulf War. The sanctions were strangling the civilian population, and in Washington, a new conversation was beginning. Quietly at first, then louder. A full invasion, a regime change, the removal of Saddam Hussein. The Pope had sources inside the American government. He had sources inside Baghdad. He had nuncios, papal ambassadors, stationed in every capital that mattered. What he was hearing alarmed him. He decided to act. The plan was audacious for a man of his age and condition. John Paul II wanted to travel to Iraq, not as a political leader, as a pilgrim. He wanted to walk in the footsteps of Abraham, the common father of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He wanted to visit the ancient city of Ur, the birthplace of Abraham, located in southern Iraq. He wanted to stand on that ground and say something simple. We share the same father. We do not have to kill each other. The Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein saw the opportunity immediately. A papal visit would be a global media event. It would humanize Iraq in the eyes of the world. It would complicate any American argument for invasion. It would show a suffering population, not a threatening regime. Negotiations began. They were slow. They were complicated. They involved layers of intermediaries, church officials, Iraqi government representatives, and the fragile network of Chaldean Catholic leaders who lived inside Iraq and maintained connections to both sides. At the center of those negotiations was Raphael I Bidawid, the Chaldean Catholic Patriarch of Babylon, a man who carried the weight of his ancient community on his shoulders. His community had lived in Iraq for 2,000 years. They were neither fully trusted by the Muslim majority nor fully protected by the Western powers who claimed to speak for Christian civilization. Bidawid walked a razor's edge every day of his life, and in May of 1999 he led a delegation to the Vatican. The delegation included the Shiite Imam of the Qadum Mosque, the Sunni president of the Iraqi Islamic Bank, a representative of the Iraqi Ministry of Religion. They carried proposals, they carried letters, they carried a green Qur'an with golden embroidery on the cover. The audience lasted over an hour. What was said in that room has never been fully disclosed. We know the outcome from Bidawid's own account, published in an interview with the Fides news agency on June 1st, 1999. The Pope had renewed his desire to visit Iraq. The delegation had extended a formal invitation. The mood had been, in Bidawid's words, one of genuine hope. And at the end of the meeting, the Pope took the Qur'an in his hands. He bowed his head. He kissed it. Bidawid described the gesture as a sign of respect for the Iraqi people, for the faith of his visitors, for the suffering of a civilian population caught between a brutal regime and a suffocating international embargo. The photograph was taken by a photographer from L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's own newspaper. It was distributed by the Associated Press within hours, and the world exploded. Conservative Catholics accused the Pope of heresy. Traditionalist websites published essays comparing the gesture to apostasy. Some called for his resignation. Others questioned whether he had understood what book he was holding. The Vatican said nothing. No official explanation. No statement of clarification. No defense of the gesture from the papal press office. Just silence, which raised a question that nobody has fully answered since. Was the silence a mistake, or was it the point? Meanwhile, in Baghdad, the photograph was broadcast on Iraqi state television repeatedly for days. The message the Iraqi government extracted from it was not theological, it was political. The Pope respects us. The Pope is coming. But the visit never happened. In December of 1999, the Vatican announced that the papal pilgrimage to Iraq had been cancelled. The official reason given was political complications. No further details were provided. Bidawid returned to Baghdad without the visit he had promised his community. He was 73 years old. He had spent decades holding his ancient church together inside one of the most dangerous countries on earth. He died in 2003, the same year the bombs fell on Baghdad. Here is what we know for certain. On May 14th, 1999, Pope John Paul II kissed the Qur'an in front of witnesses. The act was photographed, distributed internationally, and confirmed by the Chaldean Catholic Patriarch who was present in the room. The Vatican never denied it, the Vatican never explained it. That silence is the center of this story. Because a gesture that takes 3 seconds to perform has now spent 25 years without an official interpretation from the institution whose leader performed it. Think about what that means. The Catholic Church has issued official statements about events from the 13th century. It has clarified the meaning of papal gestures from the Council of Trent. It maintains an entire office dedicated to interpreting the words and actions of its leaders. And yet, about this photograph, about this specific moment, nothing. So what do the available documents actually tell us? The primary source is Raphael I Bidawid's interview with Fides, published June 1st, 1999. Bidawid states clearly that the Pope bowed to the Qur'an and kissed it as a sign of respect. He connects the gesture directly to the suffering of the Iraqi people and to the Pope's respect for Islam. That is the only first-hand testimony from someone present in the room. Everything else is interpretation. The Associated Press photograph shows John Paul II holding a green book close to his face, eyes closed. You cannot see the kiss itself. You can see the posture, the proximity, the closed eyes. Secondary sources from the Iraqi government confirm the image was broadcast repeatedly on state television with the explicit message that the Pope honored Islam. The Vatican's own newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, published the photograph without commentary. And then the archive goes quiet. No internal Vatican memo about the gesture has been declassified, no record of a papal explanation to the Curia, no letter from John Paul II addressing what he intended. Historians who have examined the Vatican archives from this period report that the documentation around the May 14th audience is thinner than expected for an event of this diplomatic significance. That thinness is itself a fact. So we are left with 3 serious interpretations, each supported by partial evidence, none proven beyond doubt. The first interpretation is the spiritual one. John Paul II was a man who had spent his entire pontificate building bridges across religious divides. He had kissed the ground of every country he visited as an act of reverence. He had embraced Jewish leaders at the Western Wall. He had entered a mosque in Damascus 2 years later. In this interpretation, the kiss was exactly what Bidawid said it was. A spontaneous gesture of genuine respect. A man of deep faith honoring the faith of others, not a theological statement. A human one. Supporters of this interpretation point to his track record, his speeches in Morocco in 1985, his consistent language about Abraham as a shared father, his private writings about the spiritual sincerity of Muslim prayer. But this interpretation has a problem. It does not explain the Vatican's silence afterward. A genuinely innocent gesture of interfaith respect would have been easy to defend publicly. The Second Vatican Council had already provided the theological framework to do so. The silence suggests something more complicated was happening. The second interpretation is the political one. In this reading, the kiss was a calculated diplomatic signal, a message to the Muslim world, and specifically to Iraq, that the Vatican stood with the suffering civilian population against Western military aggression. The timing supports this interpretation powerfully. May 1999 was the height of American bombing campaigns in the region. The papal pilgrimage to Iraq was under active negotiation. The Iraqi delegation in that room represented Saddam Hussein's government as much as they represented Iraqi Islam. A photograph of the Pope kissing the Qur'an, broadcast on Iraqi state television, served a specific geopolitical purpose. It said, "The leader of the Christian world respects you. He is coming." The West does not speak with one voice. In this interpretation, the Vatican's silence afterward was not an oversight, it was strategy. An official explanation would have forced the Church to either defend the gesture theologically, alienating conservatives, or qualify it politically, undermining its diplomatic value. Silence preserved both options. But this interpretation also has a problem. It requires us to believe that a 78-year-old man dying of Parkinson's disease performed a carefully calculated geopolitical gesture in the final minutes of a diplomatic audience, and that everyone present understood and maintained that calculation for 25 years. The third interpretation is the most uncomfortable one. It suggests the gesture was neither purely spiritual nor purely political, but something in between, a moment where personal faith, diplomatic instinct, and the weight of a dying man's final mission collapsed into a single unrepeatable act. John Paul II knew he was running out of time. His body was failing. The Iraqi visit had stalled. Washington was not listening. The bombs would keep falling regardless of what any pope said or did. Perhaps in that moment, holding a book that 1 billion people considered the direct word of God, he simply did what a man of his formation would do. He honored it, not as a theological statement, not as a diplomatic calculation, as a prayer, for a war that had not yet started, for a visit that would never happen, for the children whose deaths he had counted from his window in St. Peter's Square. But this proves nothing definitively. We do not have his words from that moment. We do not have his diary entry for that evening. We do not have a single private letter where he reflects on what he intended. The archives keep their silence, and the truth, if it exists anywhere, died with him on April 2nd, 2005. In February of 2003, a black car pulled up to the gates of the Vatican. The man inside was Tariq Aziz, Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, Catholic by birth, the most recognizable face of Saddam Hussein's government in the Western world, a man who had spent decades defending a regime that the United States had already decided to destroy. He had come to see the Pope. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. What was said inside that room has never been officially disclosed. No transcript exists in any public archive. No Vatican press statement described the content of the conversation. What we know is this. John Paul II was 72 years old and visibly deteriorating. His Parkinson's disease had advanced significantly. His hands shook during public appearances. His speech was increasingly difficult to understand, and yet he had agreed to this meeting. Tariq Aziz left the Vatican and told reporters outside that the Pope had expressed his opposition to the war, that the Holy See would do everything in its power to prevent the invasion. The Vatican confirmed the meeting had taken place. It confirmed nothing else. 6 weeks later, on March 20th, 2003, American and British forces entered Iraq. The bombs fell on Baghdad the same night. John Paul II appeared at his window in St. Peter's Square the following Sunday. He could barely speak. His voice was a whisper amplified by microphones across the square. He said the word war was always a defeat for humanity. The crowd below was silent. Washington had not listened. The diplomatic campaign that had begun with a green Qur'an in 1999 had ended in rubble and smoke 4 years later. But the story did not end there, because two things happened after the invasion that changed how historians read everything that came before. The first was the discovery of State Department cables from 2002 and 2003, released through the Freedom of Information Act in the years following the war. Those cables documented intense Vatican diplomatic pressure on the Bush administration in the months before the invasion. Vatican officials had communicated directly with American diplomats. The Holy See had requested meetings, had submitted written arguments against military action, had invoked international law, humanitarian concerns, and the specific vulnerability of Iraq's Christian minority. The Bush administration had received every communication and had proceeded regardless. The cables revealed something that the Vatican's public silence had obscured for years. The Church had not been passive. It had not simply issued statements from St. Peter's Square and hoped for the best. It had worked the diplomatic channels with the urgency of a government that understood exactly what was coming. And it had failed completely. The second discovery was more personal. In 2006, 1 year after John Paul II's death, a Polish journalist named Marek published excerpts from private notes taken by a Vatican aide during the Pope's final years. The notes were not official documents, they were personal observations. But they contained something historians had not seen before, a direct reference to the Qur'an kiss. According to the notes, John Paul II had spoken privately about the 1999 meeting on at least 2 occasions in his final years. He had described the Iraqi delegation with what the aide recorded as deep affection. He had spoken about the weight of the Qur'an in his hands, and he had said something that the aide found difficult to interpret. That he had kissed it not for the cameras, not for Baghdad, but because he was afraid. Afraid that if he did not make that gesture, if the Christian world did not find some way to reach across that divide, the 21st century would be defined by a war between two faiths that neither faith had actually chosen. He was right to be afraid. By 2006, Iraq had descended into sectarian violence that would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians over the following decade. The Christian minority that Bidawit had spent his life protecting had been decimated. Ancient churches that had stood for 1,500 years were bombed and abandoned. The community that had carried a Qur'an to the Vatican in 1999 was gone. Scattered across Jordan, Syria, Sweden, the United States. Bidawit himself had died in July of 2003, 4 months after the invasion. He did not live to see the full destruction of the world he had tried to save. He was 77 years old. He had spent the last years of his life carrying the hope of a papal visit that never came and a diplomatic mission that never succeeded. His successor inherited a church that was disappearing, and John Paul II. He died on April 2, 2005. In his final days, he could no longer speak at all. He had tried to address the crowd from his window on March 27th and could not produce a single audible word. He raised his hand and let it fall. The crowd below wept. 6 years later, in 2011, Pope Benedict XVI beatified him before more than 1 million people in St. Peter's Square. 15 years after that, he is St. John Paul II. But the question his kiss raised in 1999 has never been answered by the institution that made him a saint. On May 14, 2024, the photograph turned 25 years old. No Vatican statement marked the anniversary, no official ceremony, no reflection from the papal press office, no theological clarification from the dicastery for interreligious dialogue. The silence that began in 1999 simply continued. But the world around that photograph had changed completely. In 2021, Pope Francis traveled to Iraq, the first papal visit in the history of the Church to that country. The visit John Paul II had planned and failed to make 22 years earlier. Francis stood in Ur, the ancient city in southern Iraq, the birthplace of Abraham. the exact place John Paul II had wanted to stand. He stood there alone among the ruins, an old man in white vestments surrounded by sand and silence, and the ghosts of a civilization 3,000 years older than Christianity. He said that Abraham's land was a land of hope. The words were almost identical to what John Paul II had planned to say in 1999. It had taken 22 years, one war, the destruction of Iraq's ancient Christian community, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians for a pope to finally make that journey. Whether it meant anything is a question historians will debate for decades. But something had shifted. In 2019, Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmad al-Tayyib, signed a document in Abu Dhabi called the Document on Human Fraternity. Al-Azhar is the most important institution in Sunni Islam. Its endorsement of any joint declaration with the Catholic Church was historically unthinkable. As recently as 2003, the document declared that God wills the diversity of religions. That sentence alone would have been impossible in the Catholic Church before the Second Vatican Council. It would have been unthinkable in the relationship between Rome and Islam before John Paul II kissed a green book in a private room in the Vatican. The line between that kiss and that document is not straight. It passes through a war, through the destruction of an ancient community, through decades of silence and suspicion and violence. But the line exists. And then came something unexpected. In May of 2024, a theologian at the Gregorian University in Rome published a paper examining the Vatican archives from the 1999 period. His name was Father Rodrigo Sanchez, a Spanish Jesuit who had spent 3 years requesting access to documents related to the Iraqi diplomatic negotiations. What he found was not a revelation. It was an absence. The file for the May 14th audience with the Iraqi delegation was significantly thinner than comparable diplomatic files from the same period. Standard Vatican protocol required detailed minutes of all formal audiences involving foreign religious delegations. Those minutes, if they were ever written, were not in the archive. Father Sanchez published his findings without drawing conclusions. He noted only that the absence of documentation was itself a historical fact. That someone, at some point, had either chosen not to record what happened in that room or had chosen to remove what had been recorded. He did not speculate about which. The paper received almost no attention outside academic circles, but it confirmed something that historians had suspected for years. The official record of one of the most photographed moments in modern papal history is incomplete. Meanwhile, the relationship between the Catholic Church and Islam continues to move in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. Pope Leo XIV, who took the throne in 2025, has continued the interreligious dialogue framework established by his predecessors. His early statements on Islam have been measured and consistent with the Vatican's second tradition, but the fundamental theological questions have not been resolved. The Qur'an still denies the divinity of Christ. Catholic doctrine still holds that salvation comes through Jesus alone. The distance between the two faiths on their most essential claims remains exactly what it was in 1999. What has changed is not the theology. What has changed is the willingness to sit in the same room. And perhaps that is the most honest way to measure the legacy of a kiss that nobody in the Vatican has ever officially explained. Not as a theological breakthrough, not as a diplomatic masterstroke, but as a gesture that said something very simple. We are still here. You are still here. And the alternative to talking is what we saw in Baghdad in 2003. Whether that is enough depends on what you believe religion is for. Is it the guardian of eternal truth, unchanged and unchangeable? Or is it the most human attempt we have to reach across the darkness towards something we cannot fully name? John Paul II seemed to believe it could be both. The church he left behind is still trying to figure out if he was right. Go back to that room. May 14th, 1999, the walls lined with centuries of Catholic history, the Iraqi delegation standing in silence. A green book with golden embroidery passing from one set of hands to another, an old man bowing his head. When we first entered that room at the beginning of this documentary, we saw a photograph, a pope, a book, a kiss. It seemed like a story about religion, but now we know what was really in that room: the weight of 1,000 years of crusades, the hope of a papal visit that would never happen. The quiet desperation of a dying man who had watched ideology destroy half of Europe and did not want to watch religion destroy the other half. The fear he described in his private notes, that the 21st century would become a war between two faiths that neither faith had actually chosen. He was not wrong to be afraid. The Iraq War killed an estimated 150,000 to 600,000 civilians, depending on the methodology of the study. Iraq's ancient Christian community, one of the oldest on earth, was reduced from 1,400,000 people in 2003 to fewer than 250,000 by 2018. The world that Raphael I Bidawid carried that green book through no longer exists. And yet, Pope Francis stood in Ur in 2021, an old man in white among ancient ruins, saying the words that John Paul II had written for a journey he never made. The Grand Imam of Al-Azhar signed a document with the Bishop of Rome declaring the divine will behind religious diversity. Father Sanchez found an archive with pages missing. The Vatican has still said nothing. 25 years of silence about a 3-second gesture, which brings us back to the question this documentary cannot answer. Was John Paul II kissing a hope, a calculation, a prayer, or something so personal and so unrepeatable that no official statement could ever have captured it without diminishing it? We do not know. What we do know is this: every generation inherits the wars it did not start. Every generation is handed a history it did not choose. And every so often, someone in a position of extraordinary power makes a gesture so small and so enormous at the same time that the institution around them simply does not know what to do with it. So they say nothing. And the silence becomes the loudest part of the story. John Paul II is a saint now, canonized before more than 800,000 people in St. Peter's Square in 2014. The Church has declared with its highest authority that he is in the presence of God. But it has never declared what he meant when he bowed his head over a green book in a private room in the Vatican. That question belongs to us now. So we leave you with this: if the most powerful Christian leader on earth kissed the Holy Book of Islam in a last desperate attempt to prevent a war, and the war happened anyway, and the silence around that gesture has lasted 25 years, what does that tell us about the relationship between faith and power, and what would it take for that silence to finally end? Leave your answer in the comments below. This is The Silent Church, where the most important stories are the ones nobody officially told. We will see you in the next one.